The year was 1773. The American colonies were under British rule. Boston was one of the most prosperous American cities at the time, yet people were poor and tired of the empire enforcing laws and taxes.
Hi there, GameSpot readers and viewers. Senior Editor Kevin Van Ord here. Last year in GameSpot's historical travelogue, we took a look at some of Assassin's Creed Revelation's biggest historical landmarks to see where they'd come from, where they'd go, and what they are today. Now, Assassin's Creed 3 is upon us. Let's take a look at some of the famous places Assassin's Creed 3 depicts and explore how many of the game's landmarks still exist and just how intact they remain. First, however, a warning. Some of the information herein could be considered spoilers for Assassin's Creed 3, so proceed with caution. We'll begin with Boston and the story about a modern-day inn that pretends to be something that it isn't. One of the most important places you visit in Boston is the Green Dragon Tavern, famous for being the location where the Boston Tea Party was planned. It was one of Paul Revere's favorite haunts and was used as a lodge by the local Freemasons. This is where famous revolutionaries made some of their biggest plans, but the building, which was on Union Street, was destroyed in 1854. But that's not where the tale ends. You see, there's a modern-day Green Dragon Tavern with no ties to the original inn. The Green Dragon Tavern on Marshall Street is only a pretender, though it has done a good job of fooling locals and tourists alike with its marketing and historically inaccurate claims on its own website. The good news? Ubisoft did its research, and in Assassin's Creed 3, the tavern is more or less where it probably was in the 18th century, though it's hard to pin down its exact location. Not that Ubisoft got it right in every case. GameSpot reader Rodrigo de Andrade sent me a tip regarding this detail, and I also spoke with Marcio Neves Machado, a Brazilian programmer and Assassin's Creed 3 player who echoes some concerns other Brazilian gamers have with the Desmond mission occurring in Brazil. How odd, given the series' cultural accuracies elsewhere, that a modern-day setting would prove problematic. People's accents are odd, sounding more like Spanish speakers speaking Portuguese than actual Brazilians. The vending machines, the way people are dressed, the decor, the amount of garbage, none of it gets things right, so it stands out as particularly sloppy in a series that prides itself on cultural sensitivity. But let's jump back into history and look at a few more Boston landmarks before we head to New York. First, the Old South Meeting House, where on December 16th, 1773, thousands of Boston residents congregated before pouring into the streets. The colonists wanted 3 tea ships sent back to England in protest of the Tea Act, which represented multiple political issues, including that of no taxation without representation. At that meeting, Samuel Adams announced there was nothing more the meeting could accomplish. But that evening, revolutionaries boarded the ships and dumped the cargo overboard. In 1775, the British occupied the Old South Meeting House and started using it for horse riding practice. Today, it's used mainly as a museum where you can see reenactments of old Tea Party debates. If you visit modern-day Boston, you might make your way to Boston Common, the oldest city park in the United States. British soldiers used the park as a camp, though even before that, it was used by the public for cow grazing. In fact, so many cows were brought here that even after the number of cows citizens could bring was limited to 70, overgrazing depleted the grasses and eroded the soil. In more modern times, the public park has been home to all sorts of sporting events, festivals, concerts, and so on. Not to mention modern-day protests like the Occupy Wall Street protests that occurred across the country beginning in 2011. The Occupy protests were centered in New York around Wall Street, of course, but they also made their way to Broadway, the famed street in Manhattan. You probably already know what Broadway is all about in modern New York, though its origins aren't so glitzy. The road began as a Native American trail and was ultimately adopted by the Dutch when they settled the area. In Connor's day, Broadway was lined with churches, markets, and homes. Now, well, we know Broadway mostly for theater, though during the Revolutionary War, theater was actually suspended. In 1798, theater resumed in New York thanks to the creation of the Park Theater. Interesting note, the Park Theater was built near Bridewell Prison, a landmark you can visit in Assassin's Creed 3. The British used the prison to house prisoners of war, and it was named after a famed prison in London whose name became shorthand for police stations and detention facilities. It was a deadly place. Thousands died there of starvation, and there weren't actual windows, just bars. It was torn down in 1838, but the prison lives on. Granite from Bridewell was used to build Tombs Prison. As for Bridewell, there's a marker near City Hall Park to commemorate it, and stones mark its original location. As you may or may not know, the present City Hall of New York wasn't the original City Hall. In fact, the City Hall of Assassin's Creed 3 was the second City Hall, and later became the first Capitol building when New York City was chosen as capital of the United States. The mayor of Connor's days, David Matthews, was implicated in a plot to kidnap George Washington. He was never convicted, and when the British fled, Matthews left for Nova Scotia. Federal Hall was demolished in 1812. In 1842, Federal Hall Memorial was built on the same site and now functions as a museum. Oh, and one thing this structure has in common with several others in this feature, Occupy protesters stormed this one too. One last stop on our Old World tour, St. Paul's Church. This building has been through a lot, including the Great Fire of 1776. When playing Assassin's Creed 3, you can see just how this fire ravaged the city. Even St. Paul's Mother Church Trinity didn't go untouched. George Washington worshipped at St. Paul's while New York was still the capital of the US, but he isn't the only famed leader to worship there. Among the presidents to worship there at various times are Grover Cleveland, George H.W. Bush, and Benjamin Harrison. Amazingly, St. Paul's still stands. It's Manhattan's oldest church building and its oldest public building in continuous use. Assassin's Creed 3 is steeped in culture and history, so of course there is so much more to explore in this game, and of course in history as a whole. Thanks for joining us for this cultural travelogue, and stay tuned. There's always more to discover on GameSpot. I'm Senior Editor Kevin Van Ord.